Welcome to Fair Tax Week. I'm Natasha Turner from the Fair Tax Foundation. I'm delighted today to be joined by Simon Roberts, Senior Vice President of Sales at Unite. Unite is a Fair Tax Mark accredited business and has a report coming out imminently looking at their alignment with the new Procurement Act.
Thank you, Natasha.
Unite's latest report on value in public procurement looks at the areas beyond cost that are outlined in the Procurement Act. Where do you think fair tax fits in this broader understanding of value?
I think fair tax, it's not for us, it's certainly not for Unite a nice to have. It's a pillar, that supports our corporate social responsibility and certainly fits into our governance and transparency values that we have and hold dear to the business. And I think that in the world of the public sector is an important pillar for public sector procurement and certainly organizations downstream from the supply chain, because we're a marketplace platform that specializes in direct, and so we have thousands of suppliers on our platform, and therefore we're procuring on the behalf of public sector customers, which means that the taxpayer needs value for money, and value for money isn't just driven by price. So value for money is also driven by the transparency in the supply chain and governance and reassurance that what they buy in is being bought from suppliers who pay their fair share of tax proportionate to the timing, the size of the business, and so on. So I think in terms of where it fits into the broader procurement spectrum, and certainly in the report that's coming out, is that Unite has really demonstrated that actually fair tax is an important pillar supporting our public sector customers and organizations, and that it really demonstrates Unite's responsibility to transparency, which fits in quite nicely with the new legislation, the Procurement Act, which is again more than just price and the most economic price. It's really about selecting the suppliers that have strong governance processes and policies, and I think as we said, it goes well beyond the best price or the cheapest available price that is available in the market.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it there, but since the Act came into force, I mean, we've certainly seen that it's almost like the allowance of being able to go beyond that just cost or just price factor. How are you seeing that shift to that focus on social value play out?
Well, I mean, the big change certainly in the public sector and the procurement policies that have come out in the new in the regulations is that the selection of suppliers through tenders, many competitions, was always done on the most economic advantageous tender, and the economic in that in that sentence was always driven by price positions. Now it's changed to MAT, which is most advantageous tender. And that advantageous tender is really driven by the pillars of social value. But social value goes beyond, supply diversity or SMEs. Social value is really about corporate governance, transparency. And I think that is a significant step ahead of where it's been before, that brings in a criteria of scoring, a criteria of requirements that goes beyond the pricing, but certainly starts to establish an architecture for more compliance, more governance. And I think the fair tax is not yet, but it's hopefully will be a significant external accreditation that just gives the public sector and the public sector buyers reassurance that actually there are suppliers out there that are willing to be this transparent, and that's a societal development and improvement that's needed. All of, as better than anyone, all of the tax compliance or even non-compliance is a detrimental impact on societal and society investment and development. So yeah, I think the broader part of this is where it really does get into the fair tax as a value becomes more of a selection criteria or more weighted in its recognition how important, paying your tax on time, in full, at the right amount, in the right time frame is an important policy procedure that that is governed in the pillar of governance and transparency.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, as well as kind of being able to then differentiate yourself with that marker, as you say, what are the drivers for Unite to pursue responsible tax conduct and to go all the way to gain the fair tax mark?
Well, I think it comes back to, Unite's values. So, as a platform provider, we operate in a neutral environment between buyers and suppliers. And that neutrality is really based on trust. And trust is a cornerstone when it comes to transparency and governance. So, Unite's drivers, and I think this is what's come out in the report, is that, when you have a organization that is willing to, extend the transparency of its accounting to a point where an external provider like Fairtax can audit, and provide recommendations and continue to scrutinize organizations and certainly, Unite, it's a confidence level in the organization values. It's a confidence level in the level of transparency that is at an organizational level, not just a supply chain level. So I think the drivers and the drivers for Unite and and our cooperation and partnership with FitTax are always driven based on our company's values, and that is definitely based in transparency, governance across the entire business, not just selected to one part of our organizational process.
What would your advice be to other businesses thinking of applying for the fair tax mark?
It's a commitment. Yeah. And I think it's definitely not a process that is just about acquiring a new accreditation because it will serve a purpose in some sort of commercial gain. I think with for any organization that is really serious in taking on the fair tax accreditation, then I think it's a sign of maturity, it's a sign of responsibility. It's a real values-based process. And I think so some of the advice, I think, get your tax strategy in order. I think that's the first part of it. Really scrutinize internally, the tax strategy, and that's assuming you have one. And if you haven't, start the journey of formulating a tax strategy. And I think certainly with fair tax, I mean, we've had a great relationship, but you have helped us through the entire process. So I think sometimes, it's not as scary as people think. It's certainly with the help of fair tax. It's a very easy process with lots of help and advice. And then all of a sudden you realize that there is a community of organizations complementary to any business, because there's services, there's public sectors, there's private sector organizations who are in some tax strategy journey to continue to formulate. You realize there's a big community, so it's not a lonely place. And then outside of that, I think it's really about really communicating and taking advantage of that community and network and promoting it, because it really is a badge of honor, not anything else. And I think we at Unite, we wear that badge with pride. Yeah, and we take every opportunity to promote it with our suppliers and our customers, because it makes a difference. And I think when you really do then speak to the stakeholders, internally, externally, it is a really impressive story, and we always get a lot of accolade and positive feedback, that the fact that we've gone through this process. And so there has an economic benefit to it as well, because you are differentiating yourself, especially in the public sector, if that is a line of business that organizations are interested in. But it really does provide a level of I think organizational maturity, which I think is it's a great position for any organization to have.
Well, that's all wonderfully put. Thank you very much. And just add that our accreditation team certainly some of the least scary people out there, and would
Oh
definitely
yeah,
help
yeah.
any business with their tax strategy if they're worried about that. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so going back a little bit then, where do you see the conversation and action around procurement and fair tax going from here? Now that we've had this act out, there seems to be real momentum. What's your sort of dream
I think
goal for this
well,
conversation?
yeah, I mean, I think we touched upon it. I think the legislation now that it's in full force. I mean, I really do think it provides the architecture for more governance. Yeah. So we have, there are, more transparency on the supply chain, which is the right thing. We have to make sure that value for money and modern slavery and supply chain risk and management is exposed at a level where organizations understand how to mitigate and root out some of the problems. So it's a great start. But that supply chain initiative is complementary to adding into an additional set of checks and balances around organizations who are who pay their tax in the right process and who are transparent about their tax affairs. And I think that's complementary to the legislation. So I would like to see, in the future, more rigor, more due diligence on the supply side, around tax transparency and exposure, and the fair tax, I think, is perfectly positioned to really take advantage of the legislation and the policies and introduce that level of governance because again it comes back to reassurance in the public purse. Yeah. So, this is really about, and you guys know you have all the reports about how much leakage that exists through non-compliant tax situations. And I think there can be no argument, certainly from a public sector perspective, that that leakage is missed investment in communities and areas of infrastructure and the most vulnerable. And so I think this level of governance mandated, rather than just preferenced, would be a great development and extension on the Public Procurement Act as it stands. And I think I generally do think there is a momentum and a movement towards this level of more transparency. We've now seen it on, we've had it in terms of the on supply chain initiatives through policies. We're seeing it in compliance and mitigations or in social value. Certainly bringing in SMEs, and I think this accreditation and the opportunity for these kind of supply demographics is just it's just the next step, but a very important step that feels aligned with the overall legislation.
Just finally then, before we finish, how are you celebrating Fair Tax Week this year?
Oh well, we have a number of social media posts. We will have no doubt our annual fair tax big logo that we hold up in the business, and we have photo opportunities. And I think we will be joining fair tax in one or two events over the coming days and weeks, just really getting the fair tax message out and how Unite is benefited. And clearly, there's no, we have this report, and the timing of this report is aligned to Fair Tax Week and the promotion of everything we do around social value and governance.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Simon.
Thank you very much.